Hi. In light of the heightened tension of the Black Lives Matter movement that's been going on as of late, I wrote a letter to our church stating that we will remain committed to breaking down barriers, encouraging meaningful conversations, promoting new learning, and taking strides to improve. Now, this week's Dear Westlight video is me fulfilling part of that commitment. And there's a lot of information here. And so it's going to be a two-parter. So I'll share a few things this week, and then I'll share the rest of it next week. So today I wanted to focus on one part of this aspect, which is this. The two phrases that's been really at odds with each other lately is the phrase Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Now, why are these two in such tension with each other? I think it's because both of these statements on the surface is true, right? If you are a Christian, you believe that God has created every single human being and that his image is in every single person, thus all lives matter. So on the surface level, when you say Black Lives Matter, people would say, well, that's very narrow of you to think that. But the fact is, the phrase Black Lives Matter has a huge context, a huge historical context to it. And I think once we understand what that context is, then we could probably appreciate why Black Lives Matter is a very important phrase and that we shouldn't combat it with phrases like All Lives Matter. Now, in preparation of this video, I looked through some of my old notes from seminary, and there's this one class that I took where for one full class, the professor just broke down the history of segregation in the United States, and I want to share that with you. There's some key points here, and I can't go over every single one of them, and I also don't know if my notes are sufficient, but I'll do my best to explain to you what I learned, and I want to pass it on to you. So I want to go all the way back to the end of slavery in America, which is the Emancipation Proclamation, which was enacted in 1863. So there were 11 states that seceded from the Union for the Civil War, okay, and those 11 states, of them, 9 states, after the slaves were released, 9 states decided to enact vagrancy laws. What that means is it was illegal to be unemployed. Now, the interesting thing about this law is that on the surface level, it doesn't seem like it's a racist law, but the intent behind it was extremely racist. Now, as you can imagine, these people who were once slaves are now free. They didn't have a job. So immediately from the plantations that they were freed from, they went straight to prison. Now, of the 9 states that did this, 8 of them decided that it was lawful for them to loan out these prisoners back into the plantation, and that the state would make money off of this labor. So you could just imagine these people who just came out of slavery and now free are now prisoners, and now they're being sent back to the plantations they just escaped from. And in that plantation, keep in mind that these plantation owners, well, they're not the slave owners anymore. And what that means is they are not responsible for making sure that the slaves stayed healthy because they're not theirs. So they work them even harder. So now these ex-slaves are now being treated worse than they were before. This lasted for about 20 years after that happened. Now, in 1896, there was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. There's a man named Homer Plessy who was 10% African American and 90% European white. So by all accounts, from the outside, he looks completely white. But by law, he had to go out, and whatever he did, he had to explain to everybody, make an announcement in public that he was actually black. And for that reason, he wasn't given the same rights as everybody else, and he got fed up with this. So one day he decided to go on the train and decided to sit down in a section of the train that was whites only. And as he sat down, he announced to everybody in that train car that he was black, and then for that he was kicked out, and then he went to court, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court deemed that segregation was actually constitutional because it maintained peace in neighborhoods where there's tension between the races. And so now the Supreme Court reinforced the idea of segregation. Now, they also said that being segregated doesn't mean that one is inferior to the other. They made that very clear. But the fact is, now there's these lines between blacks and whites. Now, that eventually led to the early 1900s where segregation was a common thing. During this time, we see segregated schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, prisons, segregated funeral homes, morgues, cemeteries, and that's just a partial list. There's this one law I recall that said that a black man and a white man could not play chess together. And they all saw this as being constitutional. And that lasted for about 60 years until the court case of Brown v. The Board of Education, 1954. But in this court case, they said that segregated schools are unconstitutional because to separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in their community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. So now in 1954, it was now illegal to be segregated according to race. But 2 years after that, in 1956, the Southern Manifesto was signed by 101 out of 128 members of Congress of the South, and they pledged to maintain Jim Crow by all means possible. And 5 states passed 50 additional Jim Crow laws at that time. So for the first 2/3 of the 1900s, you'll see examples of institutions, even Christian universities like Bob Jones University, who said that blacks were not allowed to attend their schools. And the public opinion followed also, because in 1968, there was a Gallup poll that was taken, and they said that the number 1 and number 2 reasons of breakdown of law and order at that time was blacks and communists. Now, if you're getting the sense that the United States at the time really had this inherent need to be separated based on race, then you're exactly right. That's exactly what was happening. Another example would be the Federal Housing Association, the FHA, in the 1930s. Because at the time it was constitutional to separate and segregate people based on race, there were certain neighborhoods that were white and there were other neighborhoods that were black. And as the federal government started saying, hey, it's better for Americans to own homes, they started giving out loans to say, if you want to buy a house, we're going to help you by giving you a loan. But as they started to realize certain neighborhoods had a better chance of paying back the loan than other neighborhoods. So for the first half of the 1900s, the federal government was giving loans to people who were buying homes in white neighborhoods, but not giving loans to people who wanted to live in black neighborhoods. So you might be thinking, well, why can't the people in the black neighborhood say they're going to buy homes in the white neighborhood? Well, first of all, number one, it was segregated, so they couldn't do that. But secondly, until the 1950s, Realtors Code of America wouldn't allow realtors to sell homes to black families in white neighborhoods. And if they broke this code, the realtor would lose his or her license. So it was impossible for black families to move into a white neighborhood. And other things made this situation worse. Like for example, in Minneapolis in 1948, there was a huge push to build new homes, roads, and highways in the suburbs. And the majority of these new homes built in the suburbs were explicitly told not to be sold to black families. And on top of that, the FHA made strong recommendations on building highways between black and white neighborhoods so that they couldn't cross over as easily. So as the FHA funded the development of suburbs for white families, that left the black families in the inner city, and the black families couldn't develop nicer neighborhoods because the FHA wouldn't give them loans, and the families couldn't move to nicer neighborhoods because they weren't allowed to live there. Now, why is this important? This is important because a household's wealth, 2/3 of it is the house that they own. So the white neighborhoods, they were given a big push by the government to make sure that they had that wealth, whereas the people who stayed in the city, such as the black families, they didn't have that same luxury. And home ownership is an integral part of intergenerational wealth. To give you an idea what that looks like in numbers, the average black family makes about 60% wages than a white family. But when it comes to household wealth, a black family is about 10% of the average household wealth of a white family. Now from 1960s to the 1970s, as more families started moving out into the suburbs and the poorer families stayed inside the city, these factories that were in the inner city, they decided that they're going to move out too because they have more space. And so as they did that, people who owned homes in the suburbs were able to go to work, and people who had cars in the inner city were also able to go to work. But guess who didn't have a home in the suburbs or didn't have a car to drive them outside the city? Black families. So in a poll taken in 1970, 70% of black workers had blue-collar jobs. In 1987, only 28%. There's a 42% drop in 17 years. So what happens to these black families that lose their jobs? Well, you could go get an education if you have the money, but most families at that time didn't. So history has shown us that these poor black families, they would sometimes have to steal things, and that causes more and more businesses to leave that area because they don't want to be in a neighborhood where they get looted all the time. Or they start dealing drugs. Then, from the 1970s to the 1990s and on to today, there was a big war on drugs. For possession of having drugs, you could be sent to jail. And so more and more black families were taken to prisons. Now, because this video is getting really long, I'm gonna stop right here. What I hope that we could all learn from this brief history lesson is that things have not been fair for the black community since the very beginning. And what happened years and years ago is affecting people even today. I hope we see that when we say the words Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that we don't think other lives matter. It's more the fact that black lives have been so undervalued for so long that it's time that we bring into special attention to them. So next time you're on Facebook or Instagram and you see people saying Black Lives Matter, and you feel the urge to say, no, all lives matter, let's take a moment and think about all the injustices that were done to that specific group of people. Show some compassion. Take the time and say, come here, have a meal with me, let's be friends. How can I help you? How can I stand beside you? Let's have a conversation. And maybe even ask, how have I contributed to the problem of the society? And also ask yourself, does me posting All Lives Matter, does that belittle the voice of the people whose voices were already suppressed for a very long time? Now, I know this topic is a bit controversial and it might raise a few eyebrows. Now, next week, I'm going to continue this video by talking about the application. What can we do as a faith community to help this situation? So until then, thanks for listening. God bless.